Welcome back to 570. This week we're going to be talking about the conceptual foundations of library and information science research. So what this week is going to be helpful for doing is, when we get later on in the semester and we're talking about things like data collection and analysis, we're going to, at a certain point, want to step back and think about how are we certain, or how do we reason about the data that we've collected. The components that we're going to talk about today, epistemology, ontology, and methods, help us understand and reason about how we know exactly what it is we know. So let's jump in and talk a bit more in depth about each of these concepts. So the agenda for our talk today is going to look like this. I'm first going to unpack this idea of research paradigms. In order to do that, we're going to talk about ontology, epistemology, and methods somewhat separately. Then we're going to try to combine them, understand how each of these components makes up a paradigm that is applicable to library and information science research more generally. So let's start first with the idea of a paradigm. Really what we're talking about with a paradigm is something that is cohesive about a group. That is, we share a worldview about how it is something operates, or how it is that something maybe comes to be the case in our daily lives. So things like our assumptions about what constitutes valid knowledge, what makes up something as innocuous as a sandwich, are things that bind us together into a paradigm of thinking and knowing. Now, in research paradigms, the stakes get a little bit higher, right? We start to think about what is the validity of, say, knowledge, or how do we accept and we really come to understand what something knows about any given topic that they claim to know something about. So the first or most basic thing that constitutes a paradigm is an ontology. An ontology we can think about being the what of a paradigm. That is, what constitutes a reality. That is, what's made up of the world that is around us and the world that we're trying or seeking to know. So I have a couple of examples here. One is from the quiz that we took as a class, and we came up with some ideas about what we think constitutes or doesn't constitute a sandwich. And we decided that, based on what our commitments were ontologically, that is what we think a sandwich is made of, we decided whether or not something was or wasn't. And we did this kind of in a generic way at first, but then to move to be more specific over time. So you can think of other things that exist in the world right now. Some of them are really frustrating, and some of them are important to the political landscape that we work in. Something like a group of the Flat Earth Society doesn't, for example, accept years and years of scientific evidence which tells us something about our world, which is that its shape is spherical, that it rotates around the sun, that it has certain properties which make it only function as this globe. This seems ridiculous. So ontologically, our commitments bind us to one another based on the kinds of things that we believe exist in the world. Now, the next kind of question that we have, or that we want to explore, is if we think about what exists in the world, how do we gain knowledge of that? And how do we credibly validate that knowledge? So the second component of a paradigm is epistemology. That is, how we know what we know. And if ontology is what we know and epistemology is how we know, methods go a little bit deeper and tell us, well, how exactly do we gather data to know? So let's start with epistemology. So if we have how we know what we know as a basic question that we want to ask, one of the other things we might ask is, well, what does knowing mean? So epistemologists in philosophy have three criteria which they generally propose is necessary to know something. You have to believe something is the case. You have to have some justification for those beliefs. And it has to turn out that what you believe and your justification are, in some sense, true. And so we can think about this in social science as having the applicability of oftentimes we have hypotheses about the world, right? We believe something to be true. But we want to go out and systematically collect some data and analyze that data such that our beliefs are justified by the things that we find. And we make arguments, right? We pose ideas to one another and we say, we think this is the case because, well, this is all the evidence tells us. So if social science and library and information science by extension are largely concerned with how we justify the beliefs that we have, then we need systematic ways in which we go about collecting and analyzing data such that they're reliable, they're reproducible, and they have the ability to be reused by people into the future. So let's try and put all these components together: the what, the how, and the methods that we use for gathering and collecting data. So if we think about, for example, the quiz that we took, it was really a survey, right? We were asking ourselves, based on some photos and based on our yes-no judgments, or a binary judgment there, is this thing that we're looking at a sandwich? And when we have our results, so we've just kind of given over to the quiz our rudimentary judgments, we bring those results together using two variables: the structure with which each photo represented a sandwich, and the ingredients that each photo represented about a sandwich. And so when we make a judgment, say, is a hot dog a sandwich? There's really no right or wrong answer, but there is a rigorously supported answer, right? The ontology, that is what makes up reality in our paradigm, may tell us, if we're, for example, an ingredient purist and a structural purist, that no, a hot dog is not a sandwich. But if we're something like a chaotic evil, that is, we're ingredient neutral or we're structure neutral, and we don't think that there's rigid criteria about what makes a thing a sandwich, then we can probably justify what we believe to be a sandwich. The point here, right, is that there's no right or wrong answer, but there is unclear or unsupported reasoning. And what we're trying to do with research methods is use clear reasoning, systematic methods, and justify those beliefs that we have, such that other people that are also in our paradigm sort of understand and accept the things that we're claiming to know and the things that we want them to believe. So if we sum up real quick, this is the way that I think about the three components working together. We have ontology, which are beliefs about what exists in the world. We have epistemology, which is how we know what exists. And we say that that's kind of true justified belief. That's our little framework there for epistemology. And epistemology then impacts methods, which are really the tools and techniques what helps us justify our belief to our peers. And all those together is what makes up a research paradigm. It's groups of people that share an ontology, an epistemology, and a set of methods that they use to understand the world around them. Now, I made this case within our course book, but I think this is really exciting. When we start to recognize ourselves in research paradigms, we start to understand who our peers are. We start to understand the way in which we make sense of the world aligns with how other people make sense of the world. And the sense-making that we're involved in for an empirical study, like library and information science, often requires that we can go demonstrate to, say, a funder or demonstrate to our boss, hey, I know that this program is working. And how do I know this program is working? Well, I conducted a survey. I analyzed a survey using descriptive statistics, and here's the results. To sum up, we've got ontology, epistemology, and methods making up our paradigm. Now, let's look at a couple of the named paradigms, or the dominant paradigms within library and information science, before we end this week. So crudely, we can say that the dominant paradigms that exist within a library and information science right now are divided into what we think about in terms of ontology and epistemology. So positivism is the first one that we'll explore. And we can think of positivism as being about the idea that there's a single truth, and that truth is out there for us to discover and to gather data about. And this means that there's probably just one right answer to most of the questions that we're asking, even if that question is so complex that we have to ask it and attack it from a number of different dimensions. So let's contrast this idea, this ontological commitment in positivism, to the other major paradigm in information science research, which is constructivism. So a constructivist would believe that the world is complex, such that there's not one single truth out there that's up for us to discover. But in fact, it's the social relations that we build, such as language, societies, cultural mores. Those have a way of socially constructing facts, such that there's not just one answer, but there's multiple truths, and those truths have contextually dependent meanings. So let's take, for example, the way in which a positivist or a constructivist might answer a question like, what is the best book written in 2019? So a positivist might say, well, there's one answer if we set up enough criteria. So if we say length versus sales versus how informative it is, we can come up with an idea of what the best book might be. And then we can present that data to our peers saying, this is the criteria we used, and this is the analysis we did, and here's our answer. Whereas a constructivist would say, it's kind of a silly question, right? Because contextually, best can mean lots of different things for lots of different people. A 4-year-old is not going to think that Michelle Obama's Becoming is the best book, even if the New York Public Library shows that this is the most circulated book in all of their library. It doesn't mean anything to that person. So we would construct, if we were a constructivist, right, we would have a set of answers which would say, in reality, we need to make sense of and ask a more specific set of questions, and then offer that set of questions through reasoning about the world with qualitative methods. And this is one of the other big divisions between the way that positivists and the way that constructivists see answers to their question, that is, justifying the beliefs that they have about the real world. A constructivist would say that oftentimes coming to something like a number-based answer or a statistic is going to be relatively meaningless because we need to infer and we need to explain what those meanings mean. It's not very precise myself, but right, the context or the importance of those numbers. A positivist, on the other hand, will say, if I describe what the variables of my equation, or if I describe what makes up the statistics that I'm running, it shouldn't matter about the context or interpretation. I should let the numbers speak for themselves. And so we can think of the difference between the two paradigms as being, and this is very generic, so don't take it at face value, but about being one having a set of statistical numeric answers, and the other having a more narrative-based, qualitative approach to trying to answer questions about the world. Now, the real world is much more complicated than that. There's very few positivists which would come right out and deny that there are results which don't need to be contextualized. Oftentimes, I find that my colleagues who work from a more positivist standpoint are very willing to offer explanations or inferences about the results that they have. So in information science, while these are kind of rigid bookends that we can think about, positivists on the one side, constructivists on the other, in the middle are a lot of nuances. In the middle sit all of your TAs and me, right? We think about the world in much more nuanced ways than either of these bookends probably suggest. But the different ways in which people identify themselves and align themselves are really inexact. And over the course of the quarter, you'll probably start to unpack and see a bit more of the paradigms described. Something like a Marxist or a queer theorist or someone who does what's called post-positivism. All of these things are going to exist on this scale, but somewhere between positivism on the one hand and constructivists on the other. So this is our introduction to what the bounds of that array actually look like. We'll review this a bit more in lecture next week. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Thanks.